His name is Erik Prince. He was also the subject of a bombshell Washington Post report in April that he, as an emissary of the incoming Trump administration, had gone to a secret meeting during the presidential transition in the Seychelles Islands with an emissary from Russian President Vladimir Putin's office. Subsequent reporting revealed recently that the Russian in question, the Russian he met with, was the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is a wealth fund that is subject to sanctions by the U.S. government. Well, we now know, because a transcript of Erik Prince's testimony to the House Intelligence Committee has just been released today, we now know, based on the transcript of his testimony, that Erik Prince denies he went to that meeting in the Seychelles on behalf of the incoming Trump administration. He also denies that he had any idea before he got halfway around the world to the Seychelles Islands. He says he had no idea that while he was there, he would be meeting with this Russian, with the head of this Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. He says he had no idea that was going to be what he did there in the Seychelles, but he does admit that once he got there, he met the Russian guy. And based on this transcript, we now, for the first time, have Erik Prince's characterization as to what that meeting was about. I'm going to quote to you from the transcript. Prince. So, we talked about, like I said, trade matters and how the United States and Russia should be working together. Question from Congressman Adam Schiff of California. Now, trade matters can mean a lot of different things, particularly when you were talking to someone who controls a sanctioned financial institution. What in particular did you discuss regarding trade? Did you discuss the fact that certain trade was prohibited because of U.S. sanctions? Prince, I wasn't talking about trading with him, but I remember him saying how much he wished trade would resume with the United States in a normal way. So, in this previously secret meeting held during the transition between Erik Prince and the head of this Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, what they talked about was the resumption of normal economic relations between Russia and the United States and how desirable that would be. And the resumption of normal economic relations between Russia and the United States means the end of U.S. sanctions against Russia. The U.S. government and the European Union have levied sanctions against Russia, most recently for them invading Ukraine. Sanctions on Russia. Again, if you were going to get a tattoo to help remind you about what this whole scandal is about on the Russia side, what Russia wanted, why Russia might have did what they did to us last year in this election, if you needed to get a little mnemonic device, a little handy pictorial reminder, you'd come up with something that means sanctions to you. Because sanctions over and over and over again have been Russia's clear animating force. All right, that's their motivation. That's what comes up over and over and over again in all of the different instances that we know of, involving nearly 20 different Russians connected to the Russian government as they approached the Trump campaign one by one by one. Over and over again, what they were all bringing up, what they were all looking to discuss, what they were all trying to bring conversations around to was sanctions. And over and over and over again, that is what the Trump side agreed to discuss with them and later tried to cover up. When Mike Flynn pled guilty on Friday morning, he pled guilty to lying to the FBI about his conversations with the Russian government concerning sanctions. Vice President Mike Pence is now, right this second, roasting on a proverbial spit because of his repeated false statements to the American people, not just about Mike Flynn, but whether or not Mike Flynn was talking with the Russians about sanctions. Thanks to the Mike Flynn guilty plea and the statement of the offense that was released by Mueller's office while Flynn was in court, we now know that lots of senior people on the Trump transition, Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus, Hope Hicks, Steve Bannon, Tom Bosser, KT McFarland, lots of people were involved in discussions during the transition about sanctions. They knew that Mike Flynn was talking to the Russians about sanctions. That means they all also knew that Mike Pence, vice president, was lying to the American people about sanctions. That Trump Tower meeting, about which Donald Trump Jr. is now exploring the concept of attorney-client privilege. What is an attorney, really? That Trump Tower meeting was kept secret by the Trump camp for over a year. The way they tried to explain their secrecy over that meeting was by downplaying the idea that anything at that meeting was of any significance or importance. Whether you believe them or not, the one thing we are sure they spoke about at that meeting was sanctions. In February, we learned about another secret meeting that happened at the very start of the Trump administration. Trump's personal lawyer and a mob-connected Russian ex-con who has worked repeatedly with the Trump Organization, they met to write up a new Ukrainian peace plan. which they reportedly hand-delivered to Mike Flynn at the White House as national security advisor. That peace plan was also basically just a plan to lift sanctions on Russia. We now know, as of today, that the mysterious Erik Prince meeting that happened between Prince and the head of this Russian sovereign wealth fund in the Seychelles Islands during the transition was a meeting about Russian sanctions. Over the past couple of weeks, there has been a flurry of reporting about Mike Flynn pursuing and getting paid to pursue a plan to build nuclear power plants all over the Mideast. That story first broken by Newsweek. The initial scandal about his involvement in that plan was that he didn't disclose that he was working on that as a paid operative, nor did he disclose a trip to the Middle East that he had taken in as a means of advancing that plan. The next tier scandal about that plan was that he had apparently continued to pursue it up to the highest levels of the White House after he became national security advisor, despite the fact that you're not supposed to work on anything that you have had a financial interest in once you are a public official. But you know what? The night after Mike Flynn pled guilty to lying to the FBI this past Friday, Reuters advanced that nuclear story in what is now a very familiar direction. It turns out the Mike Flynn nuclear plants in the Middle East plan was also a plan to get rid of, say it with me now, Russian sanctions. The idea was to build these nuclear plants with a whole bunch of different sanctioned Russian companies. If Flynn had succeeded, if it had become the policy of the U.S. government to pursue this plan, the only way the plan could have been effectuated is if the Russian sanctions were dropped. They even figured out a little sweetener to try to bring Ukraine along, right? Ukraine is the reason Russia has this latest round of sanctions. They would understandably freak out if the U.S. was going to drop those sanctions. In order to get Ukraine to not squawk too much about it, they even came up with a sweetener deal where they'd cut Ukraine in on the deal, so they wouldn't mind too much about the sanctions on Russia getting dropped. So that whole nuclear plan, putting nuclear plants in the Mideast, what could possibly go wrong? If they had convinced the Trump administration, if they had succeeded in making it the policy of the Trump administration to pursue that, that would have created a political imperative in U.S. policy that would have required the dropping of those sanctions. They had a plan to clear the political way to do that by buying off the Ukrainians who would otherwise object to dropping sanctions. And now today, House Democrats have made public claims from a witness who says that on Inauguration Day, literally while Trump was giving his inaugural speech, Mike Flynn was allegedly texting one of the businessmen involved in this plan to drop Russia sanctions and pursue these nuclear plants. Flynn reportedly texted this business associate during the inauguration that their nuclear plan was good to go. He reportedly assured this business contact that Russia sanctions would be ripped up immediately as the Trump administration's first order of business. Now, the company is denying that Flynn sent those messages, but Elijah Cummings, the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, says, frankly, these communications are a matter of record, and you could prove it one way or another if this were properly investigated. Now, it would appear that Republicans in Congress are never going to be persuaded to investigate something like this. But it sounds like the Mueller investigation is already working on it. They may have already covered that. In Congressman Cummings' letter, which he's made public today, he makes clear that the Mueller investigation was notified about this new evidence of yet another effort to drop Russia sanctions. In this case, using a scheme, this nuclear scheme, that Mike Flynn was secretly paid to represent. Elijah Cummings notes in his letter today, quote, "In this case, my staff consulted with the special counsel's office, which asked my office to hold on the public release of this information until they completed certain investigative steps. They have now informed us that they have done so." In other words, Elijah Cummings handed this info about tearing up the Russia sanctions, handed it to Mueller. Mueller said, "We'll look into it. Don't say anything until we have." Now they have apparently looked into it, and so they've cleared Elijah Cummings to let this public information become publicly known. So a lot of movement on this today. A lot of stuff is coming to light every day now. It's like every quarter of a news cycle, some new piece of this comes to light. But bottom line, that weird Flynn nuclear deal appears to have been about Russian sanctions. The secret Ukraine peace deal cooked up by Trump's personal lawyer and a Russian guy, delivered to Mike Flynn at the White House, that appears to have been about Russian sanctions. The Seychelles secret meeting with Eric Prince and the Russian guy appears to have been about Russian sanctions. The Trump Tower meeting was about sanctions. What Flynn lied to the FBI about? Sanctions. What Vice President Mike Pence lied to the American public about? Sanctions. And now apparently what the president and his son are pretending to be lawyers about is how they cooked up their public statements about that meeting that was about sanctions. There's a lot of news going on right now. There's a lot to get to.
What's
even
the
just over
last
the
thing
course of the rest of
Obama
this hour.
did
But
before he left
with
office?
the news that we got today,
Put sanctions on
it
their
at
ass.
least finally seems clear that we at least now know what Russia was after from their side. It seems indubitably clear what the quo was that they were trying to get in any quid pro quo from the Trump campaign.